Act 1. Cold Open. A castle in northern Germany. A circular room in its northern tower. A pattern of 12 spokes set into the stone floor, dark marble against pale, lit by a single lamp held low. There is no banner on the wall. There are no occupants. There has not been an occupant in this room since the night in 1945, when an SS officer ordered the castle dynamited, and most of it survived him anyway. The pattern is real. It is not ancient. It was inlaid into the floor in the late 1930s. Every story you have heard about it being older than that was told by men who needed it to be older than that. This is the file on the institution that built it. Act 2. The record. The institution was called the Ahnenerbe. The name is German for ancestral heritage. It was founded on the 1st of July, 1935. Its 3 founders were Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer of the SS, Richard Walter Darré, the Reich Minister of Food and Agriculture and the architect of blood and soil ideology, and Hermann Wirth, an obscure Dutch-German philologist who believed in a lost northern civilization, and who was, even by the standards of his colleagues, considered a difficult man. Within 2 years, Wirth had been pushed out. The institute came under the presidency of Walter Wüst, a respected Sanskrit scholar at the University of Munich. By 1940, the Ahnenerbe was formally absorbed into the personal staff of the Reichsfuhrer SS. It had become an arm of the SS in everything but the cut of its uniforms. Its mission, written in its own founding documents, was to investigate the prehistoric, cultural, and racial heritage of the Germanic peoples. In practice, it was an enormous publicly funded apparatus dedicated to producing evidence for a story that the regime had already decided was true. It had departments, it had a budget, it had a publishing house. It had at its peak more than 50 separate research divisions, covering archaeology, philology, folklore, anthropology, music, geology, weather, and what we would now politely call paranormal subjects. It also had expeditions. Act 3. The Anomaly. The most famous of those expeditions left Berlin in April of 1938. Its leader was Ernst Schaefer, a young German zoologist with 2 prior trips to Tibet behind him. He had originally proposed a scientific expedition without ideological strings. Himmler attached strings. Schaefer accepted them. The expedition went out under SS auspices, with 5 members and a quietly enormous mandate. Their cover story was zoology. Their second mandate was anthropology. Their third mandate, never written down in plain language, was to find evidence for the regime's claim that an ancient Aryan race had once originated in the high plateaus of Central Asia, and that the Tibetans were its degenerate cousins. The expedition entered Tibet through Sikkim in late 1938. They reached Lhasa in January of 1939. They were received by the regent of Tibet, Redding Rinpoche, the 5th Redding, who was governing on behalf of the young 14th Dalai Lama. The Tibetans treated their guests with the formality due to a foreign legation. Schaefer photographed the regent. The regent gave him a letter to Hitler. The letter was a polite expression of friendship from a Buddhist statesman who had no particular reason to know what he was being friendly to.
While Schaefer studied wildlife, his anthropologist, Bruno Beger, did the work the expedition had really come for. Beger measured the heads of 376 Tibetans, by his own later count. He took plaster casts of 17 faces. He photographed bodies. He recorded skin and eye and hair color. He wrote it all down in tables. He carried the tables home. The work was pseudoscience. It was pseudoscience even by the standards of the 1930s. When serious physical anthropology was already moving away from the racial typology Beger practiced. The work was not a search for truth. It was an industrial process for producing the appearance of evidence. The expedition returned to Germany in August of 1939, 2 weeks before the invasion of Poland. They had brought back roughly 5,000 zoological and ethnographic specimens. They had brought back the measurements. They had not brought back what the regime claimed they had brought back, because what the regime claimed they had brought back did not exist. There was no lost Aryan civilization in Tibet. There never had been. What the expedition had brought back was a folder of measurements, by the standards of any honest discipline, said nothing. Skull breadth and skull length and nasal index, written down in neat columns by a young man in a wool jacket, taken in the courtyards of monasteries by a man working for an ideology that had decided in advance what those numbers were supposed to mean. The numbers, when they were checked decades later by anthropologists who actually understood the limits of physical anthropology, did not show a lost master race. They did not show anything. They were the residue of a process whose purpose had been to produce a folder, not a finding. The folder was filed. It was cited. It was used. That was the point. Act 4. The investigation. The Tibet expedition was the most expensive and the most photographed. It was not the only one. The Ahnenerbe sent or planned researchers to Iceland to study the Edda manuscripts. They sent expeditions into Romanian villages to collect folklore around Vlad Dracul, in the belief that vampire legends contain traces of an older Indo-European cosmology. They funded fieldwork in Karelia, in the Soviet-Finnish borderlands, to copy runic inscriptions from stones in deep forest. They surveyed the Caucasus Mountains for Aryan origin sites. They dug at sites in Southern Germany and Austria. They studied the megaliths of Brittany. They prepared but never executed expeditions to South America and to Antarctica. In every case, the format was same. A respected scientist would be paired with an ideological objective. The science was occasionally real. The objective was always pseudoscience. The two were stitched together by the Institute's publishing arm, which produced books and journals that gave the work the appearance of legitimacy. Some of the participating scientists believed in what they were doing. Some did not, and joined for the budgets or for the protection, or for the simple reason that working for the SS was safer than working against it.
The Swedish explorer Sven Hedin lent the Institute the prestige of his name and his Asia experience between 1937 and 1944. He was not, by most assessments, an ideologue. He was something more useful to the regime than that. He was a household name in Europe, and his association legitimized the work of men who would not otherwise have been taken seriously by anyone outside Germany. The pattern across every expedition is the same. There is no record of a single supernatural object recovered, no magical artifact, no working ritual, no credible discovery that survives modern review. What survives is the bureaucracy of the search. That is the most exact word for it. Bureaucracy. There were requisition forms. There were travel vouchers. There were carbon copies of letters between the Ahnenerbe's offices in Berlin and the German embassies in countries that had no idea what their guests were really doing. There were budget meetings about who would pay for which expedition and which department's logo would appear on the published volumes that resulted. The institution did its damage in the way modern institutions do their damage, quietly, with paperwork, with expense reports. Act 5. The silence. Wewelsburg Castle stood at the center of the institution's stagecraft. Himmler had leased it from the local district in 1934. He had its towers refurbished. He had a great hall and a crypt installed in the north tower. He had the 12-spoke sun wheel inlaid into the stone floor of an upper chamber, a design now widely known as the Black Sun. The Black Sun has no documented existence before that floor. Every claim that it descends from ancient Germanic religion, from North cosmology, from Indo-European antiquity, is a claim that begins with that floor and works backward. The castle was meant to be a stage for SS ceremonial. The ceremonies that were planned for it largely never took place because the Reich ran out of time. In late March of 1945, on Himmler's orders, the castle was dynamited by an SS demolition team. The explosives damaged the towers but did not bring them down. American forces took the site days later. The Ahnenerbe's archive was by then half ash. Wolfram Sievers, the Institute's managing director, was captured. He was tried at Nuremberg in the doctor's trial for his role in the procurement of human subjects for the criminal medical experiments at Natzweiler. He was convicted. He was hanged in 1948. Walter Wust returned to academic life. Bruno Beger lived into the 1990s. Ernst Schaefer denied for the rest of his life that the Tibet expedition had any ideological purpose at all. The records say otherwise. The records, what survived of them, were dispersed across Allied archives. They were studied seriously, in their entirety, only late in the 20th century. The most thorough modern reconstruction of the Institute is the work of the Canadian journalist and historian Heather Pringle, whose archival research was published in 2006. What she found is not a dossier of magic. It is a dossier of receipts.
Receipts for travel. Receipts for measuring instruments. Receipts for the printing of journal volumes that no one outside the regime read with respect, and that no one inside the regime had any reason to question. Receipts for human beings. The Ahnenerbe's involvement in the procurement of victims for the medical experiments at Natzweiler is in the file. and it is the part of the file that does not allow the reader to mistake the institute for an eccentric academy. The skulls in the cabinets at the Reich University of Strasbourg were the skulls of murdered people. The institute had ordered them. The institute's managing director was hanged for it. Act 6. The Archivist's Close. That is the lesson the Ahnenerbe leaves behind. It is not the lesson of a regime that found occult cower and was destroyed by it. It is the lesson of a regime that gave occult-flavored pseudoscience an enormous budget and a stamp on its letterhead and a presence in the most respected universities in the country, and watched it produce over 10 years almost nothing of value to anyone except the men who needed an old story to justify a new violence. They did not find magic. They found a mirror. They had built it themselves. If the unfinished histories haunt you the way they haunt me, there is another file on the desk. The lamp is still lit.